In the late 1920s, a man named Ichimatsu Nishimura operated a jewelry and fishing company around the mandated islands, and he took an interest in collecting pink coral from that area. In order to access the coral, Nishimura needed a submersible that had excellent diving characteristics, along with equipment for surveying and collecting the coral. In 1929, he completed a design for a 15-ton standard displacement submarine with a length of 10 meters and a diameter of 1.5 meters that had a rated diving depth of nearly 300 meters. The equipment for coral collecting was very basic. There was a grabbing arm, a sight glass, and a floodlight. The sub would be propelled by a single battery acting on one electric motor. The submarine also had a maximum occupancy of 4 crew members. Nishimura ordered his submarine, and it was constructed in 1929 at Keelung, Taiwan. Upon completion, the submarine was simply designated Number 1, and its operational history has been completely lost. We have no idea what this submarine did. What we do know is that the submarine was most definitely used, and it proved to be a solid concept. However, its implementation was flawed, and as a result, Nishimura would design a second submersible, which would be constructed in 1935 at the Mitsubishi Yard in Yokohama. What became designated Number 2 was a significantly improved vessel. It had a length of 10.78 meters, a diameter of 1.83 meters, a rated diving depth of 350 meters, a diving endurance of 1 hour. Its equipment was the exact same as Number 1, but it had a diesel generator, 2 batteries, and 2 electric motors for its propulsion system. The submarine was significantly larger, clocking in at 24 tons standard displacement. Now obviously, besides these size increases helping the quality of the vessel's operation, the main alterations laid in the propulsion system. The incorporation of a diesel motor allowed for the submarine to operate on the surface without wasting its electric batteries, and the 2 electric motors that were installed had different purposes. One was the primary motor, and the second was a reserve. I assume a reserve motor was added because the electric motor on Number 1 proved unreliable. However, without an operational history for Number 1, there's no way of verifying that. Number 2 would be used by Nishimura's firm for seafloor surveys during the excavation phases of the Kanman Railway Tunnel in 1936. While it was carrying out those surveys, the submarine would grab the attention of the Imperial Japanese Army and Imperial Japanese Navy, since neither one of these powers possessed a vessel of this type. On the 12th of July 1918, the battleship Kawachi suffered a magazine detonation at Tokuyama Bay. The ship sank, taking approximately 600 of its crew with it, and it laid largely undisturbed for a couple of decades. But in 1937, with interest in Number 2 having risen, the Japanese Navy borrowed the vessel and used it to survey the wreck of Kawachi. The Japanese Navy seemed to have less interest in surveying the sunken battleship and more interest in surveying the submarine's operation, as they would make several notes about alterations that would need to be made to the submarine for it to be a reliable unit in the Navy. The reserve buoyancy of Number 2 was considered to be a little too low, so the addition of falling ballast and buoyancy tanks would improve this issue. The propeller and rudders on Number 2 did not have adequate guardrails to prevent ropes from fouling in them, so those would have to be redesigned, and there was a submerged rudder that was redundant, so it could be removed without impacting the submarine's operation. The equipment available for Number 2 also confined what it could do while in operation, so the Japanese Navy suggested adding a sand excavator, a seawater jet, and a suction pump. Unfortunately for the Navy, in 1937, Number 2 was requisitioned and later purchased by the Imperial Japanese Army's Technical Research Institute. The 7th Research Institute would put Number 2 to great use, using it to develop active sonar and sonic survey technology for seafloor topography operations. Most notably, Number 2 would participate in the development of the Sugo sonar system, which is mounted on 10,000-ton Special Army ships and land bases, along with the Rago sonar system, which was used on small coastal ships and craft. These two systems would be used during World War II to monitor the Soya and Korean Straits to prevent Soviet submarine operations from taking place in those areas. While the Japanese Army was having a field day with the submarine, the Navy had effectively lost access to it, and, with their notes in hand, they decided to build their own versions of No. 2. This design would incorporate the improvements that I had already mentioned, and it would end up with a crew of 7, a propulsion system that consisted of 2 diesel generators, 2 batteries, and 2 16-horsepower electric motors, 1 primary and 1 reserve, at a submerged speed of 4.5 knots. Its rated maximum diving depth was 400 meters, it had an overall length of 12.6 meters, and a diameter of 1.95 meters, which clocked it in at 32 tons standard displacement. The vessel's dive time was also extended to anywhere from 1.5 to 2 hours maximum. In 1939, the Navy would order 2 units from the Kure Naval Arsenal, and these would end up becoming No. 3746 and No. 3747. Before these submarines entered service, the Japanese Navy suffered an accident on the 2nd of February 1939 when I-60 rammed I-63 in the Bungo Strait off Kyushu, which resulted in I-63 sinking with the loss of 81 crew members. The Japanese Army loaned No. 2 to the Navy in order to assist them in locating the wreck of I-63. Once No. 3746 was completed, No. 2 was handed back to the Army, and No. 3746 would survey I-63's wreck and participate in its recovery in January 1940. I-63 was taken to Kure, where it was scrapped. Following the salvage of I-63, the 3 submarines do not reappear until 1943. During the Battle for Guadalcanal, the Japanese had serious issues in resupplying their troops on the island, and thus Nishimura would assist the Army in developing the Type 3 transport submarine, and in April of 1943, 6 officers were assigned to No. 2 in order to train crew members to operate the Type 3 submarines. Following its use as a training vessel for the Type 3 crews, No. 2 goes missing from history. The vessel's fate is unknown. On the 8th of June 1943, at Hashirahima Anchorage, the battleship Mutsu suffered an internal detonation that resulted in the ship sinking. No. 3746 was quickly moved to Hashirahima with the intention of surveying Mutsu's wreck. However, later in the month, No. 3746 would only conduct 1 dive, and the Japanese would not use it again. While it was surveying the hull, No. 3746 became snagged on Mutsu's wreck, and the submarine was nearly lost. The Japanese Navy decided not to use submersibles on Mutsu's wreck again, and further surveys would be conducted by divers. As for No. 3747, while it was completed shortly after No. 3746, the submarine's early life is unrecorded, and it does not appear until October of 1943 while conducting operations for the Imperial Japanese Navy's Technical Research Institute at Numazu, Japan. The submarine would be used to further the Navy's understanding of sonar development, and at some point later in the war, No. 3747 was scuttled by the Navy off Numazu. As for No. 3746, it did not appear until the end of 1945 and beginning of 1946, when the United States occupied Japan and overtook the Kure Naval Arsenal, where No. 3746 was laid up. Upon finding the submarine, the United States assumed that it was a suicide vessel, and, because of its unknown nature, it was selected to be shipped to the United States for further examination. The submarine was taken to the relatively new Mariners Museum and Park, located in Newport News, Virginia, on the East Coast, where they would survey it, and the submarine would be simultaneously displayed to the public. In 1948, an annual report stated, "We were advised during the year by the Navy Department that the recent investigations find this to be a type of submarine for salvage work and not for attack, as we were first informed." The investigation into the submarine was assisted by Commander Fukui in his 1947 publication, Japanese Naval Vessels at the End of World War II. While Fukui's writing on these submarines was very basic and brief, it was very apparent that the submarines had limited capabilities, were not seaworthy, and had no battle qualities. With the submarine's purpose having been identified by the United States, the Mariners Museum kept the item, and it was displayed until the mid-1970s as far as I can tell, and then it was moved out of public sight. As for number 3747, its wreck was recovered in 1955, and the submarine was temporarily displayed in Numazu City, and it was later moved to Yokosuka, where it would eventually be broken up in the 1970s. As for number 3746, it was removed from the Mariners Museum's junkyard in 2019 and placed on a proper stand, and in early 2023, a roof was placed over top of the submarine to protect it from the weather. It is currently awaiting conservation. That brings the story of the Nishimura-type submarine to an end for now. Many documents regarding these submarines was destroyed, and their operational histories, plus designs, are filled with holes. These are by far the most obscure vessels the Imperial Japanese Navy operated during World War II. Thanks to their extremely low production numbers, of only 4 units being built, and only 2 of those units being owned by the Japanese Navy, these were extremely rare vessels, and the one we still have today is very, very precious. In the near future, when number 3746 goes through conservation, we will inevitably learn more about the design, construction, and operation of these submersibles. But until then, there's nothing more to add on to this topic. So, if you have enjoyed this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.